Hello, everyone, and welcome to TBR's 2021 webinar program. We just corrected the last typo on our deck that said 2020, so we should be good to go. This is Ezra Gottheil. I will be joined by Eric Costa to talk about predictions in this highly unpredictable year for both IoT and devices, which is mainly PCs. I will be joined by Eric Costa. So give us a minute and I will resume, and then we can begin the presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. Well, in all honesty, that wasn't the full minute, but I'm impatient, and there's a lot of you already on, so let's get started. Please, if you have any questions, and we welcome them, enter your questions through the question and answer box, and let us begin. There are the pictures of the two of us, and let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to review last year's predictions, I might add, that were made before the pandemic crisis. So for what they're worth, we'll be reviewing last year's predictions and how they fared in this year. Then we will talk about COVID-19 and its effect on the areas we are predicting. This is not a broad brush review of everything, but really specific to the areas we're talking about and to the most recent news. Then we'll talk about our predictions for PCs, and this has certainly been a wild and crazy year for PCs, so we'll continue to try to figure out what's going to happen next with PCs. And we have the next two topics are both on IoT. The first one is the evolution of the Chief Data Officer role. It may not be named, but the role is emerging in customer bases, and that's important for IoT. It affects much more than IoT, but it's important for IoT. And the next one is packaged components and solutions in IoT, and those are also important in the IoT space. So in review, what did we say last year at this time without any foreshadowing of this disruptive year? We talked about the silence of IoT. That is to say, IoT is important, is continuing to grow, although we did actually say that the pandemic reduced growth in IoT, but it's still a growing part of the industry, but it's becoming less and less visible. Vendors are not talking about it a whole lot. It's not really as much a distinct category of solution or application as it used to be. It's kind of subsumed under digital transformation, but it's very much happening, and it's very much a growing part of the future, and it's very much a part of our reaction to what we've learned in this pandemic. We talked about the encapsulation in IoT of AI. AI is important in lots of IoT solutions and will be increasingly important as these encapsulated AI pieces become increasingly available. It's not necessary for IoT, but in many cases it makes IoT a lot more effective. However, in generating the limitless number of IoT solutions, doing AI for each of them is obviously going to raise the cost and raise the barrier for an ROI. So what we are seeing is a lot more components that encapsulate AI in IoT. We predicted that, and that's happening in the context of everybody's attention has shifted somewhere else, and we will see more of this stuff going forward, but it's absolutely happening. And a lot of this is in recognition and discrimination functions, identifying defects, identifying patterns, identifying particular instances that have to be reacted to. There are both training and inference components to this, and in many cases, the training is done by the vendor for a large number of solutions, and the inference is being executed often at the edge by the individual instances and installations of the solution. And finally, we talked about the increasing role of conversational UIs. And by conversational, I mean spoken, as in talking to your device, whose name I will not say because there's one of them sitting next to me. I have one comment that a person cannot hear us. If anyone else is having that difficulty, please put it in the Q&A box so we can see if it's our fault. I see one comment, and I haven't yet seen others. Gonna go forward. You know, we're doing this remotely. Both Eric and I are online. We can hear each other. I'm gonna have to just go forward unless other people are saying they can't hear us. I'm sorry. We were talking about conversational UIs, and one of my points is that doesn't mean spoken alone. That also means typed. And one of the areas where I think that there will be considerable growth in conversational UIs is in applications for individual computer users. And there is a situation where a typed input would be most useful. Cortana has kind of taken over that space, but it's been a disappointment. But the opportunities are substantial. For all that, I have to say that prediction was not borne out. How much it was affected by the pandemic is difficult to say, but we haven't seen notable growth in the conversational UI space. I still think it's an area for future growth, but this year has not seen a lot of progress in that space. So let's look at COVID-19 as it affects these predictions and as it affects what's happening recently. The big one that's affected both PCs and IoT is decentralization. The work from home, learn from home, play from home situation, and how companies are responding to the threats to things like their supply chain by decentralized. Then we're going to talk about the economic impact of COVID-19 and how that interacts with these two particular segments, PCs and IoT. It's a little different from the general implications of the economic effect. And then we'll talk about the recent news. So let's get right into it with decentralization. And obviously this is work, learn, and play from home. This has had an enormous impact on the PC industry as we will be discussing. It's also very much affecting how businesses are planning for the future with what have been an existing trend of increasing amounts of work from home being reinforced by the pandemic and being seized upon as an opportunity to build for the future by many businesses. This does not mean that people will not be returning to work, but some won't, some will. And what we're seeing is that an existing trend was accelerated by the pandemic. There will be some bounce back as companies that are eager to have their people back in the offices will bring them back, but the trend line will continue for an increasing work from home situation. I think that also applies to learn from home and to a certain extent, probably a lesser extent, play from home. One of the implications of this decentralization for businesses and why they're embracing it is reduced overhead. If you don't have to provide full office support for a full staff, you can reduce what you're spending on everything that happens in the offices. But there's another indirect savings, which is reduced living costs. if the people you're hiring don't have to pay very, very high housing costs, then eventually that filters back into salaries and compensation. So we have seen at least two companies relocate their headquarters, Oracle and HP, from Silicon Valley to Texas. Now, in both cases, they already had an enormous presence in Texas. They will continue to have an enormous presence in Silicon Valley, but we've seen a kind of shift in the center of gravity. What is structurally more interesting about this is what we might see is an embracing of far more remote work, allowing far more people to be hired away from centralized offices, and some growth in smaller cities and other places where living costs are lower. Now, living costs are lower in Texas compared with Silicon Valley, but there are places across this country where living costs are now substantially lower than in Austin and Houston, where these two companies relocated. So we anticipate long-term some evaluation of more other attractive, less centralized locations for working remotely. And of course, if an employee is free to live anywhere, they can very much customize their living circumstance to their economics as well as their lifestyle. Now, with this decentralization, that contributes to a trend that overall the pandemic accelerated, which was looking forward, planning for increased resilience and transparency, a greater embrace of digitization, because looking to a world where there's a certain degree more unpredictability, where we don't know whether the virus will recur, where we've learned the lesson that too much optimization of things like a supply chain can make us vulnerable, we move to designing for a more adaptable, resilient future. And in order to do that, we have to have much more visibility as to what's going on, which contributes, of course, to digitization, and very much contributes to the growth of IoT, which is giving you feedback remotely on actual physical activities in your business. So let's look a little at the economics of the pandemic. What's happened is that while there is an overall decrease in global economic activity, and that many sectors have been hit hard, and many individuals have been hit hard, many of the people who are either continuing to be employed or are on government assistance continue to have disposable income, and their ways of disposing it have been somewhat frustrated. This has been of great effect in the PC business, where people not only are buying more PCs, they're buying more expensive PCs. So while a global total of disposable income might be down, in the PC space, it has not been the case, and people are buying more computers and paying more for them. Now, clearly, there's been a segmentation here in the effect of the pandemic on the global economy, and we can all name the worst hit sectors: travel and hospitality, and retail, and kind of outdoor, out of the home entertainment. In many cases, many of the people working in those fields are not heavy business computer users. The places that have continued to function, the remainder of the economy, are places where we quite often have one PC per employee, and if that PC is at the place of business and the person has to work from home, there goes another PC into the market. So the segmentation has contributed to the pandemic being a net positive, at least so far, for the PC industry. Looking forward, we're looking to a global economic recovery. One of the factors of knowing about a vaccine is we kind of know when that's likely to begin, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty. And question remains in that recovery whether that's going to be met by increased austerity. Up to this point, governments worldwide have been spending to keep people uh, to keep people's lives going when they can't work and they can't work outside the home. There will be a movement to reduce that spending. If that austerity is strong, we could see the same kinds of inhibition in recovery as we saw in the 2008 recession. Now, there are reasons to think the inhibition on recovery will not be anywhere near as bad in the 2008 recession, in large part because individual savings are still up. Nevertheless, a cutback of government expenditures until the global economy and the national economies are functioning well will retard the recovery, and we're not sure how that's going to end up. And finally, this is an old-fashioned term for something we talk about now as mostly robotics and AI. One of the things that happened in the pandemic is companies making long-term plans are looking to reduce their dependency on their workforce. That is to say, jobs are being eliminated. Meanwhile, we all know the technologies are coming online that enable us to, in many cases, eliminate jobs. So that long-term effect, the what used to be called automation, swallowing jobs, is still very much a possibility. The fact that we've been talking scarily about this for, I think it's 70 years, maybe even more, and it hasn't happened so far doesn't mean it will not happen in the future. And it's something to be considered, how we will adapt to the fact that we no longer need as many workers as we have in the past. In the case of PCs, it's important to note that investment is based not so much on dollars available. IT budgets can go up, but the PCs are a per person kind of expenditure. So what we want to look for both the future of PCs and the recovery is employment, and specifically employment in the segments where people tend to need to use PCs, the so-called knowledge workers. Now, we have another segment that's also people-based, but not based on business expenditure, which is individual purchases, and we've certainly seen people buying them for themselves. And then, the number of people who have the disposable income to buy PCs is a great measure of the potential market for personally bought PCs, which are home PCs. They may be they're called consumer. They're bought by individuals, but they may be bought for small businesses and things like that. Let's talk about the most recent news. And of course, the big one is the vaccine. It's effective. We've got a number of them. We're producing large quantities. There have been hiccups in the distribution. However, what the vaccine does for us, even though we can't predict the next few months, and I'll discuss that in a way, is it gives us a point in time that we can look at where we will be in a different mode and we'll be in a less dire mode. How much we'll be able to be completely resume old behavior and how fast is not clear, but it's clear that once we have general availability and acceptance of vaccines, we will be in much better circumstances with respect to the pandemic, and we can expect and predict behavior that's more typical and not specialized to a pandemic circumstance. Knowing the vaccine is there reduces our uncertainty and gives us a timeline to anticipate new things. Now, the mutations are a problem, and so far we've faced one major one, which we have expressed relief because it seems still to be responsive to the vaccines, and it does not seem to be produce worse symptoms. However, it is more contagious, and we're not exactly sure how much more contagious. And that because of the exponential nature of growth in a contagious situation could really be a problem over the next few months. We could see a much greater infection rate if this is significant and if people don't adapt to it. This increased increasingly contagious mutation that comes at the same time that there's a weariness to all the precautions. And while the vaccine is still coming into availability, we could see a very large surge in infection rates, hospitalization rates, and death rates. It's not clear how the world will react to such a thing, especially in light of a clear kind of light at the end of the tunnel coming from the vaccine. But we could see a very disruptive next few months, ones that will disrupt our industry and inhibit a lot of things. So the nature of the uncertainty has changed. We used to have kind of an open-ended uncertainty. Now we have reduced that. We know that while the pandemic may not be over in a year, it will be a far more manageable problem. We have a timeline. Nevertheless, we still have the uncertainty about the near term, and we have uncertainty about what the recovery is going to look like. So our uncertainty has been reduced. And I think it's important to separate uncertainty from actual predictable effects of this disaster. Way you plan in an uncertain situation is different from the way you plan in a more certain but still problematic situation. And this is one of the drivers for digitization and IoT. The fact that, and for resilience and flexibility and all those things, because we know less about exactly how things are likely to occur, we have to build systems that adapt to a greater range of possible outcomes. So let's talk about that. That ends the talk on COVID. Now we're going to talk about the crazy PC market, where in the face of a global disaster, the PCs did extremely well. And let me just quickly review that PCs were already doing quite well prior to this. That kind of counterintuitively, the shortages, especially in CPUs, had driven up prices and increased margins across PCs. Basically, selling with a plentiful but still restricted supply is a great boon for vendors of what are largely commodities. The restricted supply coming from the reduction in availability of high-end and then low-end Intel CPUs raised the prices and reduced the price competition in PCs. And at the same time, the Windows 10 refresh and a lot of progress in PC development had driven growth in the prior year. But then we saw everybody needing a PC, everybody working from home and playing from home and learning from home, the increased number of users. We've also seen a recognition that that a tablet is not a PC, that a smartphone is not a PC. A PC, or at least something with a keyboard, is what is needed by lots and lots of users. So an increased number of users reflects an increased TAM. So a larger market, the total number of PCs in use will be greater from now on by a considerable extent. However, if most of the sales to those new users happens in a short period of time, we could face problems with maturation, and that's the issue going forward. That's where the prediction comes in. I have been predicting a very dire 2021 for PCs. I'm less pessimistic than I was, and that is largely because of the supply chain. At the same time as demand increased, there were problems in the supply chain that limited, I wouldn't say reduced supply because we're selling more PCs than we used to, but limited the availability of PCs. The current constraints are in lower end CPUs and displays, which is where there's a lot of demand for things like Chromebook. And the fact that the supply chain did not allow the vendors to meet the demand instantaneously extended out the boom that occurred with the increase in the TAM. We would have seen greater growth back in the mid-quarters of 2020, and we would have seen a decline, I believe, going into 2021. Now, the continued constraints in the supply chain has extended that boom out into, I think, 1Q21, and I think we'll begin to see the early signs of the maturation wall be hit around mid-2021. And saturation, that is to say, everybody has the PCs they need, and that could hit kind of hard once the supply chain is fully up to speed. Basically, people who will need a PC next quarter need it now. There's not a lot of new needs coming in. I will say that the prospect of a very rough first half of the year with respect to infection rates because of the mutation, that might drive some more purchases where people were saying, well, I'll get back to work and I'll use the PC. And then they say, no, we're not going to do that. We're shut down more than I planned for. We may see another wavelet in demand coming out of that. Nevertheless, at the point where you can meet that demand, I think you will see, I don't see the actual underlying demand increasing, and I think you'll see the effect of saturation hit pretty hard and pretty fast. And the question that everybody wants to know is, what are the warning signs that you've reached that point where demand is going to drop? And the most obvious one is you're able to ship every PC that's being ordered immediately. There are no back orders. There's no out of stocks. They're basically all there. The other things I would look at is any kinds of announcements that large companies may be making in terms of headcount reductions. Some companies may have held off, and now they're looking at preparing for the future. I would look for any kind of activity in the resale market for PCs, because where you're laying off or where people have ended up with two PCs and only need one, you're going to see people selling off their relatively new, relatively competent PCs. So you see an uptick in a resale market for pretty new PCs, and that would certainly eat into the new PC market. So what will drive the next refresh? If there's been this surge in demand putting a bump in the Python, and now there's a larger percentage of users with new PCs, and the PCs last longer than they used to, we've long been seeing a lengthening of the PC cycle. What can we do to accelerate the next refresh? What will it be driven by? Well, clearly AI is the leading edge of innovation, and there's lots of room in PC utilization for artificial intelligence. My passionate wish is for a conversational UI that can get me the file I was working with, a week and a half ago, that's on this general topic, and that I had received an email or sent through an email. I want to be able to express to the PC my ever-changing needs for information. But there are lots of others. Certainly you can map the kinds of things that people are doing and suggest either ways they could do them more efficiently or kind of automation of those things. You do face what we might call the Clippy problem, which was what happened when Microsoft tried to do that more than 20 years ago. It gets very intrusive, but done right, that can be effective. There are lots of ways that PCs could become smarter and help you. And as I said, natural language processing. What natural language processing does is it lets you make specific requests vaguely by feeding back to you the points of vagueness for specific file names or dates or people. Picking at them from a list of possibilities allows you to be making much more precise requests for information or information processing. When that is incorporated into a PC, if that is done in a way that requires a newer PC, that would drive up an uptick and drive a refresh cycle. We're already seeing some effect of the more than one PC per person. where I had one at work and now I have one at home. Um, the underlying technology to make that relatively painless is well along, but not complete. Certainly using uh, cloud storage things like OneDrive uh, makes that more feasible, and Microsoft and Google are working very hard to make your experience transfer from device to device, but it still could be easier, and people could understand that it's easier to just add one more PC. And of course, you don't necessarily have to buy a PC to have one more PC. You can just keep the old one around. Nevertheless, as PCs become impressively more affordable, their overall prices aren't going down, but what you get for the money has definitely gone up. Um, there will be an inclination, if it's easy, for people to get more than one PC, and that can certainly drive a refresh, and it's a goal that vendors have long pursued and will continue to do so. Clearly, in order to get all these benefits, you have to go through software, and that's kind of a problem. Because while all the PC vendors have software development projects, for software to be effective as driving a hardware refresh, it kind of has to be ecumenical. It kind of has to be available on all the platforms. So it means that individual vendor's software will have less of an effect than it would if it was more generally available, and especially if it was available from a company whose name is Microsoft. So the software has to be there, but if you want to drive a refresh, it has to need and utilize new hardware. And that's where I see the AI coming in. I see there will be an emergence of a kind of common AI platform for some needed software on PCs. Now, we have AI silicon on virtually all the smartphones. We have the two major vendors of smartphone OSs exploiting that hardware and increasingly exploiting that. Coordinating that in the PC world is going to be more difficult, but we will get there. There will be AI software, AI hardware, AI silicon, mostly I think inference, not training, but training as well because you want to learn the user on PCs, and some common software coming probably from Microsoft, but also quite possibly from other vendors, will utilize that, and you'll get a benefit that says, I have to buy the hardware to run this software to get this benefit. We've seen that before with more common things about screen resolution and speed and memory capacity and things like that. So software drives hardware, and if you do that, you manage to drive a hardware refresh. So let's transition now over to IoT and talk about the chief data officer. And I don't know how many companies are going to end up with a chief data officer. We have a tendency to coin various C-suite titles, and only a few of them become fairly prevalent. But the role and mission, I think, are already in place and will continue to be in place. And this is because data is a key asset for companies. This affects everything, but it affects IoT particularly because IoT suffered a little bit from the disconnect between operations technology, the part of a customer company that actually manages and runs the physical plant, and information technology, the keepers of the IT backbone for organizations, where data becomes the dominant concept and the dominant asset. The roles for those two parts of the organization and for other parts, it could involve marketing or sales, become clearer. Someone is there, or an organization is there, to coordinate data and to make institutional judgments about data, to allow a delegation of solutions for individual departmental data needs to happen cleanly while maintaining a kind of inventory of data for the organization. And as I said, that's not just IoT, that's everything. One of the key roles here is the value and costs of data. With IoT, we have the opportunity to generate data at a just limitless rate. You just increase the resolution and lower the sample time, and away you go. And there's a lot of loose talk in the industry about just collect the data and it will be worth it. But everyone makes trade-offs between the value of the data and the costs of acquiring it, using it, storing it, transmitting it, disseminating knowledge about it, all the things you do with data. That is the role of the chief data officer, clearly working with financial people in the organization. But that's what needs to be done, is that has to be conceived of as what data we have, how valuable is it, what are we spending to have it, what other things can we do to extract greater value from it. That's the role of the data officer. And that helps dictate the information architecture in an organization. Where is the data generated? Where is it used? Where is it stored? How much do we need? How much do other people need, et cetera? And dissemination and making available of company data is a key part of this role. This has an implication for the organization. As I said, there was a kind of rough interface between IT and OT in the early days of IoT. And I think that has been largely worked out over the last 5 or 6 years. That is to say, OT knows what IT needs. IT knows what OT can take care of on their own. I think that centralizing the kind of keeping of data assets will help clarify that and allow organizations to handle their own data needs without too much interference, while providing for the data needs of the organization through the offices of the chief data officer. Now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Eric to talk about solution and component packages in IoT.
Thanks, Ezra. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to discuss IoT in terms of what we are seeing around solution and component packages. So when I say IoT packages, I am referring to packages that include both complete standalone solutions and components that can be easily integrated into solutions. Both these types of packages offer reduced design and implementation costs, and many of the components are encapsulations of AI that would be expensive and challenging to implement on a custom basis. So the IoT market has been around for a while now and has reached a level of maturation. Now everyone, both customers and vendors, have a much greater understanding of IoT. Vendors have migrated towards focal, more complete solutions and away from generalized solutions that require a lot of development or customization. One aspect of maturation is an increasing understanding of roles within customer organizations. The IT-OT handoff is now well understood, and OT is increasingly autonomous in choosing solutions where packaged solutions are often sold. It's also worth noting this preference for off-the-shelf solutions has been greatly accelerated by the pandemic. So from a use case point of view, IoT is no longer a blank slate upon which you can drop your solutions. Customers no longer need to invent their solutions. Instead, they are aware of solutions in their segments and subsegments and often want one of those as easily as possible. From a return on investment standpoint, except for relatively rare strategic differentiated solutions that are aimed at competitive advantage, customers want straightforward solutions with obvious ROI to make them more efficient. Because packaged solutions usually have lower total cost of ownership due to development costs that are being shared among customers, this allows them to be used for projects generating relatively lower return. From an IoT architectural vantage point, many packaged solutions are built for the edge. This is where they can be most easily deployed, and the edge is the domain of operations, which is where the most common customers for packaged solutions are found. So IoT solutions are a lot like puzzle pieces where packaged components are designed to be integrated into complete solutions. Over time, they are becoming easier to integrate. Many are options and enhancements offered by vendors of more complete horizontal solutions. And lastly, we have the vendor go-to-market tactics. Packaged solutions are narrow in scope, and they are most easily sold to those with domain knowledge, which typically means OT. This favors specialized OT vendors, often vendors with limited IT background. Vendors of horizontal solutions like platforms and general general purpose. Vendors of horizontal solutions like platforms and general purpose hardware are engaged in forming partnerships with OT vendors, in addition to systems integrators with vertical specialization. This is one of the reasons that IoT is not as visible, as the go-to-market effort is done mostly through these specialized partners. So now I'm going to turn it back to Ezra for some closing thoughts and comments before we open up to questions from everyone.
Thank you, Eric. So in conclusion, what we're seeing happening and what we see happening going forward is a greater sense of anticipation. Having this chaotic crisis immediately in front of us and seeing a world after it that has to take into account that experience has put planners for customer organizations in a position of having to react immediately to rapidly changing short-term events, but also planning for coming out of this. So I see a real demarcation between near-term and long-term planning now. And so everything we've talked about here has to do with people anticipating things, figuring out what the world should be like after we're no longer just reacting to the current crisis. We talked a bit about this. A lot has to do with managing in uncertainty, risk management, not knowing exactly the way things are going, but kind of having a sense of the range of possibility and the creation of organizations and structures that can cover that range of possibilities going forward. We're really playing around with the uncertainty itself and not so much what's going to happen, building for a world that is more uncertain than we thought and will be more uncertain going forward. And this in turn leads to resilience. Instead of optimizing for maximum performance, we need to make a trade-off between that and withstanding the uncertainty, withstanding the potential crisis. So we see a much greater reliance in everything in business on resilience, building resilience in. And that concludes our webinar for today. Please use the Q&A facility on your screen to ask questions. I have two. No, I'm afraid those were another person having audio problems, and I regret that. There are no content questions. Last call. Wow. Okay. I don't know what that means, but there you go. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I certainly wish you a much better 2021 than most of us experienced in 2020. I hope you are safe, and I look forward to talking with you in the future. TBR has an extensive program of webinars, and please come to our website to learn about the new ones. Please follow up with any questions via email if you have them. And I'm looking for the things I have to tell you. You can this webinar is preserved, and you can play it back from our website. Thank you very, very much.